October 3rd, 2014. YouTuber Matthew Patrick, owner of a prominent game culture and education channel called The Game Theorists, posed a question to his fans on Twitter, asking if they would rather see him cover the internet creepypasta legend Slender Man or a mysterious yellow bear who had been taking the world of indie horror games by storm in the next episode of Game Theory. The people chose Five Nights at Freddy's, and this one seemingly insignificant decision ended up changing the course of internet history forever by spawning one of the most influential YouTube series of all time, Game Theory's FNAF videos. FNAF and Game Theory had a symbiotic relationship, where each new game would present new, overly convoluted lore, and MatPat would do his best to solve it on behalf of the community, boosting interest in both the games and the channel in the process. Unfortunately, this process wasn't without its complications, as MatPat ended up positioning himself, for better or for worse, as the de facto authority on the lore of the games, which meant that if he got things wrong, the community's collective understanding of Scott Cawthon's intentions suffered. Even worse, Scott would sometimes have to go out of his way to correct these misconceptions in his next release, and these corrections would more often than not lead to even more confusion. It was a vicious cycle, and now we're left to wonder, did MatPat actually ruin the FNAF lore? To answer this question, we have to go back, all the way back, and make an honest assessment of whether these classic FNAF game theories hold up, and measure their impact on the community, fan discourse, and the games themselves. From their first ever FNAF video to FNAF 2 and 3, the infamous Dream Theory, and beyond. So sit back, relax, and join me as we revisit one man's mission to solve the lore and how it changed FNAF, for better or for worse.
Hello once again, theorists. Welcome to MatPat Plays. Today
MatPat's first FNAF video is very weird. It is completely unique amongst the entire Game Theory FNAF catalog, and if you showed it to a modern Game Theory fan who had somehow never seen it before, it would probably send them into a state of shock. The video opens with MatPat doing a parody of FNAF Let's Plays, which at the time were the thing happening on YouTube. Channels like Markiplier and PewDiePie were churning out tens of millions of views with FNAF Let's Plays, and they were often criticized for, let's just say, overhyping their terrified reactions.
Oh, no!
MatPat thought the game wasn't actually that scary, but was fascinated with its hidden dark lore, which he spends the first third or so of the video breaking down. I'm sure you all know it by heart by now: missing kids, killer convicted, bodies never found, haunted animatronics. Up to this point, the video is a very solid summary, with Game Theory's signature, charming style of editing, Matt's impeccable narration, and a thick layer of creepy ambience that gives the whole thing a real tension to it. But that's just the easy stuff. The questions Matt wanted to answer had to do with the identity and motives of the playable character, Mike Schmidt, and the true nature of the inexplicable Golden Freddy. And to get there, the video goes absolutely off the fucking rails.
December 1993, Aurora, Colorado. 10 p.m. Tuesday night at a local Chuck E. Cheese. Unknown to any of the five, there's actually a sixth person locked in the building with them. At 10:05, he left the bathroom, pulled out a small caliber handgun, and proceeded to execute everyone in the building. Police were at his home a few hours later, where he was promptly arrested. Eventually, he was tried and sentenced to death. I have a strong suspicion that this story is the one that inspired Five Nights at Freddy's.
So, Matt's theory was that FNAF was an allegory to this real-life shooting that took place at Chuck E. Cheese in 1993, which is a lot. He used that real story to conclude that Mike Schmidt was the killer, and the reason he comes back each night to work there is because it's all in his mind. It's the nightmares he's having each night on death row, haunted by the guilt of the lives he took. He also lined the number of real-life victims up with the number of animatronics and used their traits, which ranged from being an aggressive manager to using a vacuum to just being female, to explain each animatronic's behavior. This was definitely a stretch made to explain why Golden Freddy was different, because the victim Matt proposed he was based on didn't actually die like the others, he only played dead. I'm not going to pearl clutch and act like this was the most offensive, egregious thing he could have possibly done, because he did handle the subject matter with respect, and he definitely wasn't trying to make light of the situation, but it was still in poor taste. And this video has gained something of a bad reputation over the years. It sticks out like a sore thumb in the Game Theory FNAF canon because Matt never really did anything like this again, so it seems very shocking and unhinged in retrospect. But one thing to keep in mind is that pre-FNAF Game Theory was a vastly different beast than the one we know today. Game Theory is one of the quintessential founding pillars of online nerd culture, and their classic videos reflect that idea in its purest form. Their trademark gimmick was using beloved video game franchises to go on wild tangents about science, politics, sociology, and world history. Real-world topics were the meat and bones of these videos, and games were just a jumping-off point to get gamers interested in educational content. The other thing about classic Game Theory was that they were way more unhinged and out of pocket than they are today. Like, way more. They were not afraid to cover extremely controversial topics. So with both of these things in mind, it's easier to understand the environment this video was born out of. It's using FNAF as a jumping off point to talk about minimum wage growth, the history of Chuck E. Cheese, and unfortunately this horrific mass shooting. After its success and the success of subsequent FNAF theories, the channel pivoted into more lore-focused videos, which heavily focused on solving in-game narratives rather than educating the viewer about some real-world topic. Also, as the channel grew to become one of the largest on the website and a mainstream household name, they understandably wanted to shift towards more advertiser-friendly content and away from this. This video is like a weird halfway point between old and new game theory, and it is quite strange as a result. One thing I almost never see anyone talk about, though, is the fact that MatPat did reach a very solid, compelling conclusion here. One that definitely could have been reached without bringing up any real-world atrocities at all, which makes it all the more baffling that he even included it in the first place. If we're looking at just FNAF 1, I think Mike being the killer is a pretty solid and satisfying conclusion to come to, and there's a lot of in-game evidence, which MatPat does go over. First, if the whole game really is just a nightmare of a man racked with guilt, now that sounds familiar. It would explain why everything is so surreal and why they're never able to leave or even move. It would also give It's Me a really cool double meaning. It's me, it's the spirits of the children, and it's you. You are the reason for it all. It's pretty cool, but is it right? No. The story of FNAF 1, while it is quite vague and leaves a lot of questions unanswered, I don't think was meant to be solved past just finding the newspaper Easter egg and going, oh, so it's a haunted pizzeria, that's pretty cool. So I think that, regardless of being in poor taste, trying to make this connection to a real-life event and view the game as some kind of allegory is just wrong to begin with, and definitely not what Scott intended. It's like looking for a deeper meaning that was never actually there. We also have the wonderful benefit of almost 12 years of hindsight, so we know where the story of FNAF ended up going, and we know the role Mike Schmidt ended up playing. If he was intended to be the killer, I think Scott would have followed that up at some point, but he didn't. So, we know that MatPat's thesis in this video was wrong, but that doesn't mean he got everything wrong. Ignoring the gross parallel to the real-life shooting victim, he successfully clocked that a possible explanation for Golden Freddy's abnormality is the fact that his death was fundamentally different from the rest, which ended up being confirmed in later games. Confirmed is a strong word, but let's just say it's laid out as a valid interpretation of the story. Amazingly, he also correctly predicted that the killer was a Fazbear employee, even though that is never overtly stated in the newspapers. Even more amazingly, he predicted it by reasoning that the killer would need knowledge of the restaurant's back room.
Notice that the newspaper clippings never say it's an employee of the company luring the children away, but we know it must have been someone with access and knowledge of the employees-only section of the building.
Remember guys, this is before Purple Guy, safe rooms, anything like that. Just these 4 short newspaper clippings. Overall, for what it is, in the time that it was made, I think this video is a solid, creepy, spooky, fun game theory to watch with your friends on a Halloween sleepover in 2014, with just some really unnecessary and poorly thought out stuff in it. that did not age very well at all. Now, the question is, did it steer the community discourse in the wrong direction, or do any kind of long-term damage to the franchise? The answer is yes, but not that much. Not as much as you would think, given the subject matter. The main issue to spawn from this video is actually the date of FNAF 1's gameplay, which Matt roughly determined based on federal minimum wage rates in the US. But it was the date of the shooting which landed him on 1993. This would go on to become the generally accepted canon date of FNAF 1 in the fandom, even until today, for a decent portion of it, which is a problem because it was derived from completely non-canon, non-game information. This would later go on to affect community consensus on the timeline placements of later games like FNAF 3 and Pizzeria Simulator, since those are entirely based on guesswork of when they occur relative to FNAF 1. So 1993 ended up causing a lot of confusion. But I don't think the damage to discourse was ultimately too significant, especially compared to things we will get to later. People really want to have definitive number dates for their FNAF timelines, but I personally think that the year of most FNAF games is not important as long as you know when it happens relative to everything else. I would go so far as to say that the reason the paycheck date in FNAF 1 is obscured is because Scott didn't even know or care about the exact year. He just wanted to set the game vaguely in the late 80s or early 90s. Hot take, I know, but really ask yourself if hashing out exact dates for these games we already know the general placement of is really that fun, interesting, or worth fighting people about. It's not. Anyway, that is MatPat's FNAF 1 video, and it's time to move on to MatPat's FNAF 2 video is much different from the first, and it marks that change in Game Theory's channel direction we were talking about earlier. He even says in the intro sketch that he is here to answer any questions the game may have left unsolved. This isn't a video that's going to use the game to veer off on some wild tangent. This is a video that makes a promise to solve FNAF, and this promise comes with a lot of responsibility. This video marks the inception of MatPat solidifying his role in the community as the definitive one-stop shop for solving the lore of each new FNAF game as they release. He has to deliver a satisfying conclusion to the fandom when, oftentimes, there is no such thing, at least for the time being. That means that not only must every video be watertight, focused, and as thorough as possible, but it also must live up to the astronomical expectations of the fans created by Scott. So even if Scott's story was sucking, it was on MatPat to make it work for everyone. It put pressure on him, it put pressure on Scott, and it put pressure on the community at large. For better or for worse, Game Theory was molding the discourse of FNAF, and that was going to be the shape of things to come from that point on. With all that being said, this video is pretty good. Matt spends the first portion settling the sequel or prequel debate, which, yes, was actually a debate at the time, and of course, he gets it right. Not that it was very hard to do, because FNAF 2 being a prequel is explicitly stated in the game. It's not subtextual at all, but nevertheless, it's a great note to start the video on. He then starts laying out a primitive, antiquated FNAF timeline, which was necessitated by the addition of this new location, the mention of an older location, and the incredibly vague name drop of one Fredbear's Family Diner. Things were getting confusing fast, but Game Theory's fantastic writing and editing really makes it easy for the average viewer to understand. For the second game, this is 100% a correct timeline, and it serves as a great starting point for community discussion about things like the MCI or what happened at which location. It would honestly be pretty hard to get this wrong with the very little information we're given, but MatPat still deserves props for it. With the timeline established, Matt goes on to examine the four most important lore drops in the game, the 8-bit post-death minigames, and tries to establish what they mean for the story. The first one he analyzes is the Save Him minigame, and he concludes that it depicts the murder of the child who possesses the puppet outside of Fredbear's Family Diner, the first event in the timeline which sets everything into motion. And at least for the time, this is correct. Obviously, we know that this kid possesses the puppet because it's explicitly shown in the game, unless you think the puppet jumps out of the screen for just no reason at all. But the question is this actually Fredbear's Family Diner? I think MatPat's reasoning for this is okay, given that all we knew at the time was that it was probably the first location and therefore probably smaller in scale than the rest. The problem is, I don't think Scott intended for this to be Fredbear's at the time, because he likely already had plans to reveal it in a future game. MatPat obviously couldn't have known that, but I think this is a case of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You have this Fredbear's name drop, and you have this minigame, so to complete the puzzle, you have to fit them together like two pieces. But we know now that that's not how Scott writes these games. In his 2024 interview with Dawko, he talked about how he would often leave dangling plot threads in games that he intended to pick up later on.
You know, whenever I'm making these games, there are a lot of things that are in my head that are just flowing ideas. And when I have them and put them there, it's the first half of something. It's like a string or a rope just like reaching out. And then whenever I progress forward, the rest of that just reappears. The rest of it appears and just fits into place perfectly. That's how all my games have been made. But then sometimes when things do progress, the roads aren't always the same roads as the ones that had been planned before. The progression of the story didn't go there. And so those strings never got pulled on. And those and the other half of that idea remained in the ether, remained in my subconscious.
Some, like the box, never got followed up on, while others, like Fredbear's, did. Unfortunately, like we discussed earlier, MatPat was in a position where he had to completely solve the lore as each game came out, even if the lore was literally unsolvable because the story was only partway done at that point. If Matt had said in this video, Fredbear's Family Diner is something we don't know about yet, but we'll probably learn more in the next game, fans would have been disappointed at his lack of a comprehensive solution. This would have been seen as a non-answer instead of a correct and reasonable assessment. With all that being said, this still might be Fredbear's, but my point is that it would have been perfectly reasonable to assume otherwise at the time. Who knows, maybe Matt could have started a Puppet Kid 87 conversation all the way back then. But regardless, this is not the worst conclusion to draw here. After explaining why the MCI must have happened at the left to rot location, true, he looks at the Help Them death minigame, where the puppet gives gifts and gives life to the dead kids. He unfortunately says that the puppet stuffs the kids into the suits, which as we know now is almost definitely not true, since William has been shown in nearly every continuity to be the stuffer. That's like his whole thing. But it's not too bad since he's still got the gist of the minigame down. I think at this point in the series, puppet stuff was reasonable. We then get to the infamous Save Them minigame, which depicts an event known to fans now as the Dead Children Incident, contrasted from the Missing Children Incident as their bodies are plainly out in the open. This event is still one of the most bewildering in the entire series because it's so vague. It's not clear when it happens, how the spare yellow suit in the back factors into it, if at all, and what it has to do with the investigation described by Phone Guy. It's really weird, and MatPat understandably does not harp on the details too much here at all. He basically chalks it up to Purple Guy striking again, using the same suit, we didn't know about Spring Bonnie yet by the way, to murder a new set of 5 kids at this restaurant, which is a perfectly fine and probably correct explanation that just leaves a lot to be desired. Then again, that's how I would describe most DCI theories, so Matt was pretty much hitting the mark here. So the video is almost wrapped up, and Matt has, I would say, accurately summarized the lore of FNAF 2 with a few minor stretches, but yeah, very good job. I really hope the video sticks the landing and doesn't launch itself off the rails in the last few minutes.
But is the Purple Man really someone we've never met and who's only worked there a week? Or is it someone we trust? Someone with a long history with these characters? Someone no one would suspect? The head guard. The one forced to fill empty positions and teach new recruits by leaving them instructions over the phone. Is the Purple Man the Phone Guy?
Ah, of course. This part of the theory is a well-known meme in the FNAF community, and for good reason, because it's really silly and clearly not true in hindsight. And it was MatPat's signature crack theory for a while before that other one. His general evidence is pretty much that Purple Guy is a security guard and Phone Guy is also a security guard, which is true, but obviously doesn't mean that they have to be the same person. Phone Guy refers to the Purple Guy as the first guard, the one who gets moved to the day shift and eventually fired. Is he talking about himself? How can he be both fired and working there at the same time? It doesn't make much sense. His strongest evidence is that the Phone Guy says he never liked the puppet and Foxy was always his favorite. And both of those sort of line up with Purple Guy too, although I think this smile here is more of just a general I'm evil smile, not a OMG it's my favorite character Foxy smile. And then his final massive bombshell mic drop moment is this mysterious object in Purple Guy's hand, which as he puts it is
very clearly a phone.
And to be fair, we still don't really have any idea what this thing is supposed to be, but a phone makes very little sense. I mean, it's shaped like a handheld receiver of a wired phone, but it's not hooked up to anything, he's just carrying it around. And why is he attacking Freddy with it? It's not a phone. The biggest issue I have with the Phone Guy is Purple Guy theory is that it's just so pointless. Like, the Purple Guy doesn't need to be anybody at this point in the story. His identity isn't supposed to be this big puzzle we have to figure out. Narratively, the story needs Phone Guy exactly in the role he already fills. It does not need him to secretly be the killer on top of that. Basically, I think it's another case of looking for comprehensive answers to absolutely everything where there are none there to begin with. Matt's final point in the video explains why the puppet isn't in the first game when it has no real in-universe reason not to be, and he thinks that its spirit is still in the building, manifesting as these ghostly crying child posters, which is fair. I personally think they're meant to convey just a general creepy, haunted vibe of the whole building, but at the time, sure, why not? And that is MatPat's iconic FNAF 2 video, which is overall awesome. It's an extremely solid translation of the game's vague lore into an easily digestible story for the average fan to understand, with some notable exceptions, of course. And now, of course, we have to ask if this video was good or bad for fandom discourse and for the series as a whole. The answer is complex, because it both was and wasn't for different reasons. When it came out, I think it was, like I said, a great surface level assessment of the game's story. It had a clean timeline, it correctly identifies where the MCI happened, and most importantly, I think it provided a good, solid baseline of understanding to facilitate further discourse about the game. Its biggest issue, Phone Guy, was, from what I remember at the time, not terribly egregious, because people did not take Matt's word for it. There were lots of theories about Purple Guy, and him being Phone Guy was one of many. It didn't dominate the discourse or block out other potential ideas. Strangely enough, the damage to fan discourse came about a year later, but it wasn't Matt's fault whatsoever. It was Scott's. He made a Steam post about the upcoming FNAF 4 Halloween update. This is probably the single most impactful statement Scott has ever made on the lore, so believe me, we will definitely be coming back to it later. The part I want to highlight now is this paragraph.
You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed at how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right. Then Part 3 came out, and once again the story was uncovered by the community. It seemed there was nothing I could hide.
This is the closest Scott has ever come to outright confirming literally anything, so people understandably treat this statement with a lot of reverence. The video we just watched, which summarizes the lore of the first two games, has received a golden seal of approval from the man himself. Matt got almost everything right. Unfortunately, a lot of fans have since taken this statement way out of context and kind of used it as a weapon to dispel any alternative takes about the first two games. Charlie died in 87 at the FNAF 2 location? Well, that's a cute theory, bud, but that's not what MatPat said. And Scott said MatPat was almost 100% right, so that can't be true. Oh, the DCI didn't really happen, or it did happen, but it's not what everyone thinks? Well, no, because this line of argumentation, frankly, sucks, and it's really Scott's fault for being so vague about exactly what he meant here. He says this all to lead into his main point in this post about FNAF 4, which is that he was amazed its story didn't get immediately figured out like the other games did. Game Theory's video correctly identifies that FNAF 2 is a prequel, lays out a timeline, and demonstrates an understanding of the game's story. Scott's using it as an example of how the community more or less understood the general idea of what FNAF 2 was about, to make the point that the community did not share that same understanding of FNAF 4. FNAF 2 is an extremely dense game with a lot of weird contradictions and complications that are still being unraveled today. A lot of things that Matt's video never even addressed. But now, anyone who wants to have a discussion about it has to be faced with this Steam post as if it's some kind of counterpoint, which is annoying, yes, but more importantly, it limits the scope of theorizing. Again, definitely not Matt's fault, and I still think this video is a great one. A classic, if you will. Anyway, moving on to the next installment of Game Theory's FNAF series, FNAF 3. MatPat's third FNAF theory is my personal favorite, partly because it came out when I was at the peak of my FNAF obsession and it was very exciting, but also because I think it offers a solid explanation of the first 3 games, or at least half of a solid explanation. It also begins with MatPat's best intro of all time.
It's time.
Chills. Just like with the last video, Matt establishes that this theory's objective is to solve the lore, to answer as many questions as possible that were hotly debated topics in the community at the time. So expectations were high. Also, side note, these YouTube search results are such an incredible time capsule. You have elders react, teens react, Minecraft animations, terrible React channels that would just steal content, Smike, who would obviously never steal content. Right off the bat, we get an extremely out-of-pocket MatPat moment where he shows some suggestive Tumblr posts, which there's obviously nothing wrong with. It just comes out of nowhere and I think it's really funny. It's also the most replayed part of the video by far. We then arrive at the first main section of the video, where he basically revisits his FNAF 2 timeline and updates it with the information we got in FNAF 3. There was something really satisfying about the way these old game theories tried to build a continuity with each new game. It really made it feel like they were part of one ongoing project rather than just standalone theories. He doubles down on Save Him taking place at Fredbear's using the same evidence as before, but this time throws in something much more compelling. If you're tracking Purple Guy's murders as you would a serial killer in a crime drama, it would make a lot of sense for this to be his first, before he developed his signature pattern of killing. So, Save Him being at Fredbear's and happening first in the timeline is quite well evidenced here, but keep in mind that Scott was likely planning to reveal Fredbear's in the next game, so that may not have been something we are intended to put together. He moves on to the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, which he claims to be the location depicted in FNAF 3's Stage 01 minigame, because the presence of the 2 Springlock suits lines up with Phone Guy's tapes from that location. This is tricky because at this point in the series, it's implied that these Springlock suits are older than the rest and date back to Fredbear's family diner. But they were also definitely used at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, so there was no real way to know which of the 2 this was supposed to be. With the benefit of hindsight, we know it was probably Fredbear's family diner, but still, if Matt got that wrong, it's not that big of a deal. Unlike this next thing.
After learning of an unfortunate incident at the sister location involving multiple and simultaneous spring lock failures, the company has deemed the suits temporarily unfit for employees.
2 employees are killed by the failure of a bodysuit and a Freddy suit.
So, a few things. One, this is the first of several very frustrating instances of Matt fundamentally misunderstanding what a Springlock failure is, which is funny considering it's one of the maybe 3 things in the entirety of FNAF that actually gets explicitly, thoroughly explained in the games. Multiple simultaneous Springlock failures refers to multiple Springlocks within one Springlock suit failing simultaneously, which is what happens to Purple Guy in the last Follow Me minigame. It's the reason why the suits are so dangerous. It does not mean multiple suits experiencing this simultaneously at exactly the same time. Regardless, Matt uses this to branch off into his first theory about Shadow Bonnie and Shadow Freddy.
Where else in the game do we see Bonnie and Freddy sharing a unique feature that no one else in the game possesses? Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are tied to the ghosts of the employees who died in the spring suits.
Honestly, it's not that bad, and I think it's close to the best possible answer you could have had at the time. The fact that the shadow animatronics mirror the two Springlock suits is important, and this is a reasonable explanation for their good-natured behavior in the minigames. Unfortunately, it all hinges on this idea that two employees were killed at the same time in the Springlock suits, which is just not well evidenced. MatPat moves on to go over the MCI once again, and he correctly identifies that Purple Guy used the Spring Bonnie suit to commit the murders. This is pretty overtly hinted at in the FNAF 3 phone guide tapes, which are actually some of my favorite lore drops from the entire series. It's just so eerie to hear generic corporate memos being recorded as the MCI is happening right under their noses. Really good storytelling on Scott's part. Anyway, Matt then doubles down on his assertion he made in the last video that the puppet stuffed the kids into the suits instead of the killer. And just like last time, it's probably wrong. It also seems unnecessary, like if it actually were the puppet doing the physical stuffing, that doesn't really change anything major about the story, so whatever. The important part of this section comes next, when MatPat takes his first real swing at solving Golden Freddy.
Golden Freddy is a decommissioned Springlock suit at this point, deemed too unsafe to be functional. The reason he's slumped over and can't move like the rest is that his endoskeleton has been taken out. He's in suit mode, not free roaming mode. This also explains the lone naked endoskeleton that appears occasionally in both Five Nights 2 and Five Nights 1, an endoskeleton that once belonged to Golden Freddy.
So, no, that's not really how this works at all. I can buy that Golden Freddy is slumped over because he's in suit mode, but that does not mean his endoskeleton was taken out and is now walking around by itself. It just means that his endoskeleton has been compressed to the sides of the suit interior, held in place by spring locks to make room for a person to fit inside. Again, just fundamentally misunderstanding spring locks. Not to mention, these two endoskeletons aren't even the same. To me, this is another case of MatPat forcing himself to explain every single thing in the games and give everything a definitive, satisfactory answer. So when there is no satisfactory answer in reality, he has to try to fit square pegs into round holes to try to forcefully tie everything together. Golden Freddy is weird for reasons we don't understand. There are these two random endoskeletons that are never explained. So therefore, these two things we don't understand must have an explanation that fits them together like two puzzle pieces. The reality was that at the time, Golden Freddy had no explanation because the story of the games was not over yet. The ending of FNAF 3 was leaving the door open for things like Golden Freddy and Fredbear's Family Diner to be followed up on later. But of course, Matt couldn't have said that because that wouldn't be solving the lore. On the other hand, the endoskeletons were very likely just spooky Easter eggs. I think saying that would have been just fine. Matt ends the video by kind of recapping why FNAF 2 is a prequel to the first game and why it takes place after the original restaurant gets shut down for health violations years after the MCI, which is all correct. He briefly touches on the DCI again, basically reiterating why it's a new set of murders at the new restaurant, and yes, the DCI is still super confusing, but this is a very reasonable interpretation. He walks back the assertion that the object in Purple Guy's hand is a phone, which is really funny considering what happens in the next video. Epic Doctor Who reference, by the way. And that is the end of the first half of Game Theory's FNAF 3 episode. I remember as a kid, I loved this video so much. I was totally on board with the Shadow employees, on board with puppet stuff, Golden Freddy endoskeletons, whatever. And the wait for part 2 was so unbelievably agonizing, especially considering it got delayed at least a few times, if I remember correctly, and nothing could have prepared me for how disappointing it ended up being. In the second part of MatPat's big FNAF 3 theory, he reiterates that he's here to answer as many questions as possible about the lore. He keeps listing Purple Guy's identity as the most important of all these questions, but to this day, I just do not understand why. I explained this when he was covering FNAF 2, but basically I don't think Purple Guy's true identity was important to the story at all at this point, and I highly doubted Scott had it in mind until around the time of FNAF 4. It's pretty clear that William Afton as a character was conceived as Scott was developing the story, and if it were important by the time of FNAF 3, there would have been some kind of indication of that anywhere in the games. So we'll see if MatPat tries to force a solution where none exists again in this video. After the recap, the video almost immediately nosedives into a confusing mess when Matt attempts to explain the discrepancy between Phone Guy calling it a summer job and the paycheck being dated November, which he skimmed over in the FNAF 2 video.
There is not a single place in the world where November is a summer month, meaning that these tapes, all these tapes, are pre-recorded. And honestly, that shouldn't be a surprise. Phone Guy's calls are recordings in every game. All of Phone Guy's messages are unstuck in time, not recorded anytime near your tenure as security guard. That includes the ones in FNAF 2 talking about children going missing. The pizzeria isn't being shut down for an investigation of some missing children the week you happen to be working there. You're listening to old tapes meant for the night security guard from months ago.
So the summer job line was supposed to be the single clue that recontextualizes the entire game by telling us that the restaurant opened in the summer, closed down shortly after Purple Guy did the DCI, then reopened again in November, a week before finally closing a second time after the bite of 87. I will hand it to Matt that this is a very creative way to explain the summer job fiasco, but it unfortunately just does not line up with what we see in the game at all. First, using this image of the intro newspaper here is extremely confusing, because it implies that it's evidence for the restaurant being reopened in November, but no, it's clearly referencing the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This is the grand reopening of that vintage restaurant. Also, Phone Guy's calls being pre-recorded in FNAF 1 and 3 does not necessarily mean they're pre-recorded in FNAF 2 as well, because in both of those games, the fact that they're pre-recorded is relevant and important to the story, whereas in FNAF 2, Phone Guy is talking about the animatronics becoming more aggressive and the place closing down in real time as you see those things happen. It doesn't make sense for them to be pre-recorded. On night 6, Phone Guy directly addresses the current night guard, us, and tells him that he's on day shift for the final birthday party tomorrow, and that he should stay close to the animatronics and make sure they don't hurt anyone. Considering the context of everything, this is clearly implying that Jeremy is the bite of 87, which MatPat agrees to be the case.
Jeremy passes the test, and on his paycheck at the end of the week, he's welcomed into the family, presumably getting moved to day shift. Fritz gets hired to replace him on day 7, but then promptly gets fired for tampering with the animatronics. That means he's not likely the one to get bit, and instead the person who follows him on day shift is, leaving Jeremy as the most likely frontal lobeless candidate.
But hold on a second. We know Jeremy is moved to the day shift because of what the Phone Guy says, not either of the paychecks he receives. But Matt also says that those calls are all pre-recorded from months ago, not addressing Jeremy at all. Literally just a complete contradiction. Finally, MatPat uses this final newspaper as evidence that the bite is what shut down the restaurant, which is definitely at least partially true, but you cannot use bits and pieces of this text and ignore the part which clearly states the restaurant was open for only a few short weeks, not months, meaning it was only open for the first week Purple Guy worked there and the second week Jeremy worked there. Bending over backwards and twisting the timeline of FNAF 2 completely out of shape just to make this one throwaway line make sense at the expense of so many other plot points is just flawed reasoning. And it did unfortunately lead to a lot of people thinking that the summer job thing was a hugely important lore hint and not just a mistake on Scott's part. FNAF 1's Steam description also refers to it as a summer job, but you don't see anyone making a fuss about that. Anyway, Matt then goes on to explain why Mangle is the most likely candidate for the bite of 87, which is definitely one of the more popular theories regarding that event. I personally could just never get behind it, since Mangle was not a functional robot at the time. So if she was acting aggressively, it wouldn't cause the rest of the toys to be scrapped for malfunctions too. Either way, it doesn't really matter. The rest of the video is actually pretty solid. Matt explains why the original MCI location is most likely the same building as the FNAF 1 location, which is widely accepted to be true even to this day. He also gives an accurate recap of Springtrap's origin story and the events of FNAF 3. And that's pretty much the end of his analysis. The second half of this video primarily consists of who he thinks the purple guy is, which he's building up to be the ultimate most important question of all. It's not.
All logic points to it being the phone guy.
Oh. So, to double down on phone guy, purple guy theory, Matt recaps some of the evidence from the FNAF 2 video, which we already kind of debunked, but they are admittedly interesting points worth considering at the time. However, the new evidence he draws from FNAF 3 is legitimately incomprehensible.
Consider this. He's the only person in the game who knows about the safe rooms. As we've mentioned before, all the safe rooms were sealed up back in the Springlock suit days, back in the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, meaning every other employee coming afterward would have never even heard of these things. Phone Guy is the only character we meet who would have any knowledge of these rooms, and more importantly, of how they operate, how they're invisible to the cameras, and more importantly, to the animatronics. He's also the only person who knows how to use the Springlock suits. We know for a fact the killer was using one of the yellow Springlocked suits, and Phone Guy is the only character we know who had knowledge of A, where they were hidden, and B, how they were operated safely.
What? But Phone Guy's tapes explain the safe rooms to general employees, so he is definitely not the only person who knew about them. That goes for the Springlock suits too, which Phone Guy also explains. The killer could have been any one of those employees that heard these training tapes, or even one of the higher-ups who passed this information down to Phone Guy in the first place. Also, Matt keeps saying the only person we know, but why does the killer have to be someone we know? It's like this weird criteria he created for himself to try to solve this non-puzzle. It's extremely weird. Matt then says that even someone who knew how to safely operate the suits like Phone Guy could still get himself springlocked like Purple Guy because he didn't account for the rain leaking into the building in his panic to escape the ghosts. Which is true, but how does that in any way prove that Phone Guy is Purple Guy? Again, any employee who listened to these tapes would also know about the danger of the suits, so this is just irrelevant. Speaking of tapes, Phone Guy literally calls out the Spring Bonnie suit being noticeably moved, which implies that it was being used for murder by Purple Guy. If it was him moving the suit, it would make no sense to draw attention to it like this, but Matt leaves that part out. He then addresses the elephant in the room, the fact that Phone Guy dies in FNAF 1 and Purple Guy dies in the Springlock suit, so they can't be the same person. Or can they? You're gonna have to hang in there for this next part because it is confusing.
If Phone Guy was the killer, why would the robots still be active after his death and the ghosts disappear? It just wouldn't make sense unless you stop to consider the rest of FNAF 3's endings. By completing the game normally, you get the bad ending, in which we see Purple Guy die in a flashback minigame, and the whole thing ends with 5 masks representing the 5 main animatronics with lights on behind their eyes. In the good ending, the souls of the dead children have been put at peace. When they disappear for good. The good ending doesn't exist until you, as the player of the 3rd installment, give cake to those kids during FNAF 3's hidden minigames. What you play in FNAF 1, though, is the aftermath of the bad ending, when the animatronics have killed Phone Guy, but are still out for vengeance. Yeah, you made it through those first 5 nights at Freddy's. You overheard the death of the Purple Guy recorded live on the phone, but it wasn't enough. You got the bad ending. Even with the killer crippled in the back room in a Springlock suit, the lights are still on in these animatronics.
So please tell me if I'm missing something, but even if FNAF 1 is somehow supposed to be the aftermath of the bad ending which takes place in the future, how on earth does that explain or even address how Purple Guy supposedly died twice in 2 different ways? It's not like Matt said that each death takes place in a different ending. It's just a question of whether or not the spirits of the kids are able to move on afterwards. It has been just over 11 years since I first watched this video, and I am still every bit as dumbfounded now as I was then. I cannot for the life of me, no matter how many times I rewatch this part, follow Matt's train of logic here. It's actually brain melting. It actually feels like trying to solve the FNAF lore, but we're trying to solve what Matt is talking about here. The best explanation I have is that he's just trying to address the counter to Purple Guy, Phone Guy theory of, oh, if Purple Guy is the killer, why would the animatronics still be restless after his death? And yes, the existence of the good ending does potentially explain why that would happen if he were the killer, but again, unlike what Matt claims, it does not address how he dies twice. Thankfully, the video ends on a much better note because Matt correctly identifies the fact that the puppet is physically present in FNAF 3, unlike the Phantom animatronics, and posits the idea that it was responsible for the fire at the end of the game, which I think was a fantastic theory at the time, and explained the fire in a narratively satisfying way. Speaking of which, if you feel narratively satisfied by this video so far, please leave a like to let me know you've been enjoying it. While you're down there, feel free to subscribe to the channel too, so you don't miss the next upload. To summarize my thoughts on both his FNAF 3 videos, I think the first one is great and the second one is awful. It is incredibly confusing, it spends way too much time on the Purple Guy, Phone Guy stuff, and it was disappointing because I think it could have spent more time analyzing, frankly, more interesting stuff. Despite its flaws, I think MatPat's coverage of the game did help fans understand the general lore and timeline better, and same as FNAF 2, I don't think Purple Guy, Phone Guy theory steered people in the wrong direction in a meaningful way. It was already a meme in the community at that point, and I don't think many people were actually buying it. And that is the end of Game Theory's FNAF 3 coverage. If you thought it was, maybe a little messy, a little all over the place, a little confusing, well, Game Theory ended up doing 4 videos on FNAF 4, plus 1 livestream, which we will talk about, believe me, and they are all vastly different from each other. They are also probably the most important FNAF videos ever made, in terms of their impact on the games, Scott, and the fandom. So in other words, yes, we have saved the best for last. The first video came out just a week after the game, which is an incredibly fast turnaround, and it shows. Based on what Matt says in the intro, this was supposed to be a predictive theory that came out before the game's release in October, but since the release date was suddenly moved up to late July by Scott, the game ended up coming out first. Unlike the other FNAF game theories so far, this one is not trying to solve the lore, but rather use the game as a jumping off point to talk about real-world science and history, a la classic pre-FNAF game theory. The video's point is that the game is scientifically impossible because the player character is clearly the victim of the bite of 87, and since losing your frontal lobe means your brain loses the fear response, they are not physically capable of having nightmares. He starts off the video briefly explaining why this is the bite of 87, and the majority of its runtime is spent discussing real-world history, psychology, and neuroscience. It's interesting stuff. Only one slight problem.
Was that the bite of 87?
No. As we all well know by now, the FNAF 4 minigames most likely take place in 1983, thanks to this TV Easter egg and confirmation in later games. Regardless of the true date, I think it was pretty clear that this is not the bite of 87, since we already know for a fact that it happened at the FNAF 2 location and resulted in the animatronics not being allowed to walk around during the day anymore, and Fredbear is clearly on the stage, not walking around. So this video is very wrong. My game theory is that this video was supposed to debunk the premise of the game before it released, probably just using the source code, teasers, and trailer to establish a similar argument. But when the game suddenly came out super early, Game Theory had to decide whether to can the video or put it out anyway since it was already so late in its production process. They kept the same argument, used the same research to disprove it, and just did not thoroughly research the actual game enough or let it simmer in the discourse for a while. The result was a wrong video. But is a wrong video with 21 million views really wrong? I bet I know Game Theory's answer. Anyway, I think this video has incredible historical value as a testament to how confusing FNAF 4 was in general. The 87 source code teasers are genuinely stupefying and started the game off on a terrible note, since before anyone could actually try solving the lore, the community had to have a massive debate about 87 versus 83. This video is not the cause of that debate, it is merely a symptom. I mean, if you look around, it clearly wasn't just MatPat who was confused. Before we move on to his first attempt at actually solving FNAF 4, we have to talk about Scott's infamous Steam post that's been looming large over this entire video so far. On August 24th, a month and 1 day after FNAF 4 came out, Scott made a community post on Steam giving fans an update about the upcoming Halloween DLC for the game. At the end of the post, he talked about why that DLC would not be addressing the box.
You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed at how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right. Then Part 3 came out, and once again the story was uncovered by the community. It seemed there was nothing I could hide. But then I released Part 4, and somehow, no one, not a single person, found the pieces. The story remains completely hidden. I guess most people assume that I filled the game with random Easter eggs this time. I didn't. What's in the box? It's the pieces put together. But the bigger question is, would the community accept it that way? The fact that the pieces have remained elusive this time strikes me as incredible and special. A fitting conclusion in some ways, and because of that, I've decided that maybe some things are best left forgotten forever.
We already discussed that first paragraph at length, and we will discuss the second one later, but I want you to keep it in mind as we move on to the next Game Theory video. This video is MatPat's first true attempt at solving FNAF 4 the same way he solved the last 3 games, and it is fine. First, he addresses the fact that the last video was wrong, and actually shows a supposedly deleted comment from Scott himself on that video, which is very interesting, because it shows that he really wanted to steer people in the right direction and figure out FNAF 4. MatPat was so off track that he had to directly step in. We will see this happen again. Matt makes the correction and retracts his assertion that this is the bite of 87, and then goes on to pinpoint when and where in the timeline the game takes place. He stands 10 toes down and decisively states that the restaurant in the minigames is in fact Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, not Fredbear's Family Diner, evidenced by the FNAF 3 phone guy tapes which reference the 2 Springlock suits, as well as all of the Fazbear merchandise and memorabilia. This, again, is tricky, because there is a lot of evidence going in either direction here. One of the teasers for the game explicitly said property of Fredbear's Family Diner, and Fredbear is not only featured prominently on stage, but on the side of the building in a way that really screams titular mascot. I really do think this is meant to be Fredbear's Family Diner, but of course, it's never that easy. The existence of the main Fazbear cast of characters and the multitude of implications that the MCI is currently going on or has already happened really make it seem like this could be Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which would line up with the phone guy tapes like Matt says. My current best solution to this is to say that both restaurants were simply open at the same time, which explains a lot, but also feels very weird considering how Fredbear's is referred to the original restaurant in FNAF 2. Regardless, I think Matt is justified in saying that this is Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, but not in what he says next.
Phone guy tells us the suits have become decommissioned after an incident where there were, quote, multiple simultaneous Springlock failures. What do we see at the end of FNAF 4? An incident where multiple Springlocks fail simultaneously and a child dies.
So here, MatPat corrects his original misunderstanding of how Springlocks work on a fundamental level, then miraculously misunderstands them in a completely different way, which is actually amazing. Like, how was this not fact-checked better with months between this and the last lore video? It baffles me. Yes, multiple simultaneous Springlock failures means multiple Springlocks in one suit failing simultaneously, but no, that is definitely not what's happening here. As Phone Guy describes in excruciating detail, the spring locks are activated in order to retract and hold in place the robotic mechanisms of the animatronic, so that one person may fit inside and wear it as a suit. If the animatronic is already in robot mode, as Fredbear clearly is here, the spring locks are not activated, so they literally cannot fail. This is just his mouth closing like it's supposed to. This drives me crazy. We literally see what a spring lock failure looks like. How is Game Theory finding brand new ways to get this wrong? I guess for this particular video, it doesn't matter too much since the rest of it is spent trying to figure out Bite Victim's identity and overall role in the story, but it's still frustrating because it's just misinforming people about some of the most basic surface level information in the entire series. Putting that aside, the rest of the video is actually pretty good and succinctly highlights why FNAF 4 was so confusing. This time, Matt doesn't have a definitive answer. He doesn't solve the lore, but instead dissects two sides of an argument for who Bite Victim is without taking a firm stance either way, the puppet or Golden Freddy. Knowing what we know now, Puppet Victim may seem completely laughable and ridiculous, but at the time it was a very popular interpretation of FNAF 4, and for a lot of good reasons, which Matt outlines. First, there's the visual similarities, the box imagery, and circumstantial evidence like that, but the most compelling argument comes from the Fredbear plush's dialogue. Also, this is the first instance of one of MatPat's most iconic bits of all time. As you're probably sick to death of hearing at this point if you've watched my theory videos, this dialogue strongly suggests that the plush is haunted, possibly possessed by the spirit of a child Bite Victim saw get killed in the MCI. That explains why he's so upset, the playground rumors, why he's afraid of the springlock suits, these are my friends, and a lot of other stuff. Don't even get me started on my favorite theory, okay? MatPat says the plush is haunted by the spirit of Golden Freddy, which makes a ton of sense if Bite Victim is the puppet, but runs into a lot of problems under the other main interpretation. Bite Victim is Golden Freddy. MatPat's angle is that Puppet Victim has more evidence and works better if you're trying to solve the lore as if it were a puzzle, but Golden Victim works better from a storytelling standpoint, which is undeniably true, and it's the interpretation that has stood the test of time. Before delving into Golden Victim, Matt goes on a quick psychology tangent to explain why FNAF has seen so much success as a game franchise whose fandom is fueled by debate and discourse. It's basically a long way of saying that the lore and story of FNAF is extremely vague and never gets definitively answered, and there are so many different ways to interpret everything, so we're basically psychologically driven to keep trying to solve it in perpetuity. His ultimate point is that FNAF 4, and therefore the series as a whole, is impossible to solve definitively, which is unfortunately probably true, as defeatist as that sounds. He then unpacks why Golden Victim is more narratively satisfying, mainly citing how well the birthday party lines up with Happiest Day and gives that moment a deeper meaning, and why Golden Freddy is always shown to be grouped with the MCI victims, but slightly different. I am partial to this interpretation of FNAF 4, mostly because I see it as the logical conclusion to the story of the first 3 games, but the biggest speed bump has always been Psychic Friend Fredbear, since it's unclear who they're supposed to represent if Bite Victim is Golden Freddy, and Matt points all of this out. The only part of his version of the theory I just cannot abide by is Bite Victim witnessing the puppet's death, because we know for a fact that no springlock suit was used in that crime, and there would have been no reason for him to be scared of those specifically. If you were to have seen one of the MCI murders, that makes a lot more sense, but unfortunately, him seeing the puppet became a very popular fan theory that still has strong believers to this day. MatPat ends the video by presenting the audience with a choice of which FNAF 4 interpretation they prefer, which is definitely a first for the series. I do really like this video. I think it's one of the most high quality we've watched so far in terms of analysis, even if it does get some stuff wrong. I don't hate the fact that Matt doesn't plant a stake firmly in either camp. After all, as we've discussed, his role as the lore solver was one that he put on himself. But I think the video would have been better if he chose one path to interrogate further and put forward as the best option. Thankfully, or maybe not so thankfully, this is not Game Theory's final word on FNAF 4. At the end of the video, Matt promotes an upcoming live stream where he would be answering fan questions about FNAF that he didn't get to cover, and he teases a potential special guest appearance. The stream would be attended by a panel of all the top FNAF YouTubers at the time, which would be a landmark event for the fandom's history. But nobody, not even Matt himself, could have possibly predicted who the real special guest would be, and that stream would change the course of FNAF forever.
welcome to GTLive, the stream that was preemptively canceled last time. Not canceled, we shut down YouTube.
So, I lied actually. It turns out the original stream as advertised in the video was cut short preemptively due to tech issues. But the second take of the stream would go on to change the course of FNAF forever. The stream was hosted by Matt, of course, accompanied in person by Alex, one of Game Theory's writers and resident FNAF expert. The online panel consisted of YouTubers Razbowski, Ryan and Ryan of 8-Bit Gaming, Dawko, and Smike. It is hard to overstate just how monumental of a crossover this stream was in the FNAF community. The FNAF YouTube landscape has changed a lot over the years, but these were the original top channels for non-Let's Play FNAF content. Say what you will about the, let's say, range of quality of this content, this was still huge. This was the moment where the entire FNAF fandom stopped and came together for one beautiful moment. And this, of course, attracted the attention of one Mr. Scott Cawthon. Halfway through the stream, after all panelists but Dawko had been dropped due to connection issues, Scott started updating his website, which was being closely monitored at the time due to the evolving FNAF World teaser, with 3 massive hints to try and steer the conversation in the right direction. We'll get there in a moment, but let's rewind to take a look at something a lot of people have forgotten about. What was the discussion that prompted Scott to drop these hints? The first fan theory they discuss is, I shit you not, that Purple Guy is Bite Victim's father, mainly evidenced by the fact that he's at the restaurant against his will so often and Purple Guy works there. Figuring this out before sister location is genuinely incredible, and whoever this commenter is should be commended. But I would like to point out that this was a somewhat popular fan theory at the time, so I'm glad it got its moment to shine in this stream. After discussing that for a bit, Matt brings up the garbled FNAF 1 phone call that can be partially heard in the background intermittently during FNAF 4 night gameplay. And the panel discusses what that could possibly mean. They ultimately come to the conclusion that Bite Victim may in fact be Phone Guy's son, if not the Purple Guy's. Sure, but that doesn't really imply anything for the story of the games. Why would it be so important to show us this kid's death if he were just the Phone Guy's son? Alex lays out his crack theory that Phone Guy may have actually been a copycat killer of the original Pink Guy, and it's at this moment when the stream crashes temporarily, which was probably for the best. They scramble for a while to get everyone back in the call, have some more lighthearted discussion in the meantime, then, right as they were about to launch back into the lore talk, the stream crashes again. Shortly after they come back, first contact.
Okay, yeah. Close view, sir.
Looks like
there we go.
Looks like Scott's been making some comments about the stream crash.
Yeah, Scott's making comments too. What's Scott saying? According to Twitter, who do we got on Twitter?
Commented on Steam 11 minutes ago.
Yeah.
They were getting too close to the truth.
Oh, we were getting too close to the truth, according to Scott. Scott!
I'm a hungry boy sitting at the bottom of a meat chute, Scott.
What?
Clearly a joke, but it confirmed that Scott was indeed watching. The stream is now down to Matt and Alex with other Team Theorist members in the background, and respecting the viewers' democratic wishes, they cement Purple Guy as Bite Victim's father in the community consensus canon, which is an historic moment that I think has been lost to time somewhat. Suddenly, Dawko messages them and lets them know that Scott has apparently emailed him a message that he wants to be revealed on stream. They work to get Dawko back on the broadcast when Stephanie alerts them that they're being inundated with tweets regarding the latest update to Scott's website, an update that contained the first of 3 cryptic hints to guide their discussion.
So clearly this is something that a lot of people have screenshotted off the Scott games.
In the FNAF 4 minigame, why would the tiny toy Chica be missing her beak?
In the FNAF 4...
This is some esoteric.
This is insane. Okay, in the FNAF 4 minigame...
Okay.
Okay.
Dawko joins and confirms that Scott's email contained that same question. Considering what the discussion has been about so far, it seems like they were not exploring the paths that Scott really wanted them to. They weren't getting to the heart of what FNAF 4's story was. Even if Purple Guy was truly Bite Victim's father, that was not the type of question Scott wanted them to be asking. So he stepped in and asked it for them. Mere minutes later, before they even have time to comprehend the insanity of this situation, let alone answer the question, Scott drops his second hint.
Dawko, can you confirm or...
Hold on, I'm sorry. Scott's done another question. Oh God, he said, what he's seeing in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. Silence.
Confucius say.
What is seen in the shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child?
Yes, that's exactly what he said.
Tackling the Toy Chica question first, Alex suggests that it could be an indicator that the toy animatronics existed in some form as far back as 1983, but struggles to find a reason for why that would be so important for Scott to point out. Then MatPat says this.
This is weird, okay?
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that immediately jumps to my mind. Is it possible, again, this is completely off the wall, is it possible that FNAF 2 didn't actually happen?
And it was just, yeah, I know what you mean.
Like, is it possible?
What?
They begin discussing the possibility that, based on these two clues in conjunction, the FNAF 2 gameplay is Bite Victim's dream, much like FNAF 4. Alex immediately pushes back.
Like, the kid would have to have knowledge of things that, like, no child, like, why would he know even about, like, how paychecks work?
But I mean, sure, maybe, but again...
But once again, before they even have a chance to hash it out, Scott drops his final clue.
He said...
Oh, this is still from Scott?
Is this email?
No, apparently it's from the website.
Alright.
It said 4 games, 1 story, I'm getting.
It's all the...
So, hold on. Yeah, he said 4 games, 1 story. That's what he said on the website. 4 games, 1 story.
I mean, we were assuming that it was kind of one story, I mean...
Immediately after that, a chatter with Scott's name and icon said, "Have you thought of who the security guard is?" Although this was confirmed by Scott via another email to Dawko to be fake only a few minutes later. Still, that combination of hints prompted them to take the conversation in a completely different direction.
Because it is one of the final biggest questions of the franchise. The security guards, what role do they play in all of this, right?
So, based on this rapid sequence of events, it seems like Scott initially wanted them to notice the Toy Chica beak and talk about that, while also taking into account that what is seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. As soon as Matt started cooking up FNAF 2 was just a dream, Scott immediately rushed in with a much more simplified, direct statement, which really makes it seem like he realized they were misunderstanding what he meant and wanted to course correct as fast as possible. The context of when each hint was dropped is just as important as the hints themselves, but is often left out of the discussion. Weirdly enough, it was the fake comment that actually led them to the biggest revelation of the stream, the fact that Foxy Bro is the security guard from the first 3 games.
We know that we have a guy, it might be the same guy going through multiple names, Mike Schmidt, Jeremy Fitzgerald, and Fritz Smith. So if Scott is saying 4 games, 1 story, is there a possibility that the brother from FNAF 4 could be all of those characters?
Remember, this was before Sister Location. Before Pizza Sim, there was no Michael or William Afton. This is just based on the first 4 games alone, and it is right. Scott loves his twist endings, and FNAF 4 is no exception. The twist of FNAF 2 is that it's a prequel. The twist of FNAF 3 is that the killer has been in the suit the entire time. The twist of FNAF 4 is that the nightmares aren't being had by Bite Victim, as we're initially led to believe. They can't be his because he's dead. Instead, they're being had by his brother, who accidentally killed him and goes on to work at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as a security guard. That's why the nightmares are so similar to FNAF 1, and why you can hear the phone call in the background. Matt and company didn't quite get that far, but they got far enough.
I think that there's something to the theory that we were talking about Golden Freddy, about the birthday party that we see in 3 of the dead kid. Like like a good scenario version of the birthday party where the kid gets bit.
One of the things that has always bothered me, one of the details that has always, like, I've wanted to come up with, like, what it is and why it matters, is the quote of "It's me." Golden Freddy, a Golden Freddy suit, has severely injured and or killed a child in front of his brother. The brother in FNAF 1, the brother from FNAF 4 could be the security guard from the first FNAF. You know, Golden Freddy is starting to haunt him with the words "It's me." It's me as his brother, the brother that he helped to kill. The other thing you have to remember is that whoever is the security guard in FNAF 3 has to have been present in some capacity at all of the other locations.
Yes.
Because he is having the phantom animatronics, the hallucinations he's having.
That aren't physically present.
That aren't physically present are of Balloon Boy, are of Mangle, are of all these characters, creatures, creations that have appeared in past iterations of the franchise.
He always comes back.
The stream slowly wraps up over the next 20 minutes or so, and with its end, the fandom was left with the most earth-shocking event in the game's history, and lots of new ideas to ponder. Somewhere within those ideas was the true solution to the lore of FNAF, and it was up to MatPat to put the pieces together and deliver that solution in the next episode of Game Theory. It was all down to him.
Which hand of the witch hand will it be?
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
That one. Wrong!
That cannot be allowed. How is that fair? How is that even fair? Oh, where are we?
Did I pick the wrong hand?
Oh, we were right there, man!
We have now arrived to Game Theory's most well-known FNAF video, and possibly the most impactful FNAF theory of all time. It was their response to the events of the preceding livestream. First, Matt drops this line.
I'm back to finally put the original FNAF tetralogy to rest.
Which has permanently etched itself into my brain and is now one of my favorite terms to use in my videos. So every time you hear me say original tetralogy, a little piece of MatPat's light is shining through me. He quickly recaps the events of the stream and unveils the theory.
What if everything in FNAF was just a dream?
So it looks like out of the many ideas discussed on the livestream, Matt and company ultimately chose the one that Scott hastily interrupted to course correct, which is unfortunate, but let's hear him out.
Of the 3 clues Scott gave us that day, the most damning one was the last one. Why would Tiny Toy Chica be missing her beak? That missing beak directly parallels FNAF 2's new version of Chica, who loses her beak when she goes on the attack, and that is when it started to click. FNAF 2's shiny new animatronics. What are they called? Toy animatronics. That's a strange name for a bunch of robots, right? Unless it's meant to be taken literally and then they're all just a bunch of oh my god. What if they are toys, and this is all just a dream scenario inspired by these little guys?
Okay, so granted, the Toy Chica beak clue is super weird and ultimately not a particularly helpful hint, so I completely understand why this would be your logical interpretation of it. But, again, and this is why I spent so much time going over the livestream before this, you have to remember the context in which Scott saw it appropriate to introduce this clue. The conversation leading up to that moment was about whether Purple Guy or Phone Guy was Bite Victim's father, which was absolutely a valid thread to follow, but not one that Scott wanted them to get too lost in the weeds over. He wanted to direct their attention to the beak and the shadows. That does not mean that the beak is the most important thing in the entire series and needs to be regarded as game-changing evidence. It just means that it's something Scott wanted them to take note of. Something that got closer to the heart of what FNAF 4 was about. I mean, as soon as Matt started down the dream theory rabbit hole, Scott jumped in again with a third, much simpler clue that ended up guiding them in the right direction. So why is this video essentially ignoring that chain of events and doubling down on dream theory? I think I know the answer, but let's keep watching.
But it explains a bigger question about FNAF 2, the look and design of Mangle. I mean, seriously, the story we're told to believe in this game is pretty absurd, that kids just rip it apart and put it back together again, and so the employees just leave it as a mangled collection of parts for small children to play with. But if we assume FNAF 2 is in the mind of a child who has seen all these toys, Mangle makes a whole lot more sense. He's just a dismantled toy.
So obviously the fact that Mangle is an absurd, unrealistic concept is not evidence for dream theory at all. FNAF is a ghost story survival horror video game with heavy sci-fi elements. I don't think I have to explain why it's not realistic isn't a good argument for anything.
And toys explain FNAF 1 too. The crying child of FNAF 4 has 4 plushies in his room. The crew from FNAF 1. Plushies, as in soft, stuffed animals. What are the original 4 animatronics made out of? Soft materials. Fur and fabric. So much so that the one thing that we hear about them throughout the series is that these old animatronics collect odors and never get washed, just like an overused and overloved stuffed animal. Why is Foxy out of order in FNAF 1? Well, the plushie he's based on is missing its head.
I know I said we have to hear him out, but as he goes through these points of evidence, there are just so many problems that are really difficult to ignore. The foul odor is literally a direct implication that the missing kids' bodies were stuffed into the suits. It's one of the most well-established facts in the entire canon. You cannot just pluck it out of its original context and reassign it to this. The Foxy plush's head is missing in this game because the kid's brother is using a Foxy mask to scare him, so Foxy's face would also scare him. It's literally in the game, it's not that deep.
Every game, design detail, and animatronic can be explained under this theory. The recurring elements of the phone and the fan, right there from some of his favorite toys. The fact that no one in their right mind would work in a place like this? Dream. Firing an employee for something like odor? It's a child's imagination of what employment is like. How about the weird metaphysical hoops that you have to jump through to access FNAF 3's minigames? Well, dreams have weird rules where dialing codes into cinder blocks makes perfect sense.
Literally every single one of those pieces of evidence can and should be used to support the other theory discussed on the live stream, the theory that the brother is the security guard in all the games. It's so hard to watch all these really interesting ideas get absorbed into this. Matt goes on to list a bunch more parallels between these minigames and details from the first 3 games, and he incorporates Scott's second clue to say that Purple Guy never actually murdered anyone. He was just helping an employee get into a suit, and Bite Victim thought a murder was happening, which apparently caused him to dream about an incredibly detailed news story about a string of murders at different locations from multiple perspectives, and then dream that the victims of these murders were freed in a version of his birthday party from the future which had yet to happen yet. While we're at it, I guess he also dreamed accurate minimum wage rates for dates in the future and correctly predicted how inflation would affect wage growth. Damn, so he must have been like the smartest preteen child ever to live, who also had clairvoyant abilities of future foresight? Maybe he was just watching a lot of Professor Jong. At this point in the video, the theory is already kind of the worst, but it's time for Matt to deliver his final nail in the coffin. The
one piece of evidence that no one can deny and that, to my knowledge, no one has talked about in the months of theorizing. The detail that convinced me this theory has to be true. Are you ready to have your mind blown? Listen to the sound that you hear at the end of every night of the first 3 games. Why would the end of my shift in an office be signaled by a grandfather clock chime? It wouldn't, unless I was asleep, dreaming in my house with a grandfather clock right outside my room. But now let's look at FNAF 4. How does each night end there? A beeping alarm clock. Why? Because we're no longer in the crying child's house. We're in a hospital. No hospital has a grandfather clock, but they're all equipped with a generic digital alarm clock.
So obviously this part of the video has become a huge meme in the community because Matt is dropping this like it's the most insane, mind-blowing thing we've ever heard, and it's just completely wrong. Hospitals don't notoriously all have digital alarm clocks. Like, yeah, maybe some of them do. Digital alarm clocks are capable of existing within a hospital, but to say that they are a standard default inclusion in every hospital ever is insane. It seems like maybe they would be since they're more clinical and high tech, but that's just vibes and aura. That's not actually true. So that's the meat of Dream Theory, but the video isn't over. MatPat spends the remainder of its runtime looking at the theory from a meta perspective and exploring what its broader implications would be for the FNAF fandom at large. He admits that while it has potential to be the overarching solution to the entire series, Dream Theory is entirely too easy, because it can just be used to explain away any number of inconvenient details which any other theory has to bend over backwards to make work. Despite this, he insists that it is Scott's intended solution to FNAF, and he cites his statement in that infamous Steam post we discussed earlier. He said there's no random Easter eggs, so all of those references to other games are clearly there to tell us that those games are dreams. He asks would the community accept it that way because he knew that Dream Theory would be controversial, so he'd rather leave it unsolved and let the community interpret the game how they want. To be fair to Matt, this is a reasonable reading of this statement if you believe Dream Theory to be true, but I still do not think that's what Scott meant at all. I think he meant that he thought FNAF 4 was clear enough, somehow, for us to generally understand in the same way we generally understood the first 3 games, and was genuinely surprised that it wasn't. Instead of coming out and solving it for us, opening the box, he wanted to leave it be and let the fandom discuss the true meaning of the game forever, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. At the end of the video, Matt concedes that while the main night gameplay of each game may be a dream, there is still some amount of real lore to be had, citing the playground rumors and Bite Victim's seemingly irrational fear of whatever he saw. And all of that will come in his next video, the final FNAF 4 game theory. But before we move on to that, let's close the book on Dream Theory once and for all. Members of the FNAF community today know Dream Theory as one of the worst, most laughable FNAF theories of all time, for all the obvious reasons we went over. But at the time it came out, it was hailed as the best possible answer to FNAF 4 that we had seen so far, at least on a mainstream level. We know now, with the benefit of 11 years of hindsight and damn near direct de-confirmation from Scott himself, that it was wrong, and we're now able to collectively move past it and try to actually solve FNAF 4. But unfortunately, Dream Theory severely limited discourse in a way that was unprecedented by Game Theory, and it was because of all the problems we've been spending this whole video talking about. The community, by and large, at the time, looked to MatPat to solve the games, to translate their confusing, disjointed lore into an easily digestible story for the average fan to understand without having to play the games or look into it further. Up to this point, he could get little to medium stuff wrong, like Phone Guy being Purple Guy, the date of FNAF 1, the functionality of the Springlock suits, silly stuff that still left room for debate. But to get this much wrong in one video and call it solved was devastating. FNAF 4 is confusing. It's extremely cryptic, it's very hard to understand, so to have an answer as simple and all-encompassing as Dream Theory was the perfect solution for casual fans. They didn't have to worry about the headache of FNAF 4 anymore. They had their solved MatPat certified answer and they could move on. But that meant that FNAF 4's true solution would be forgotten forever. And we were so close. You saw in the live stream that they were arriving at the correct answer, or at least some version of a more correct answer. So once again, why did they choose the bad ending? Why did we end up with Dream Theory instead? Looking at how the stream went down, I think the answer is simply because security guard Foxy Bro was not able to incorporate all 3 of Scott's hints cleanly, and the fandom absolutely expected them all to be adequately addressed. Dream Theory could work them all in, so that's the one that made the final script. And that mistake boils down to Matt and company not catching on to what Scott was trying to say, and Scott not being clear enough about what he wanted them to know. There are many ways to explain these first 2 hints, and the community has tried, but I genuinely think that Scott's intended meaning for them will forever be lost to time. He was trying to point them in the right direction, but he didn't want to give away too much, and he was just too vague and ended up confusing everyone. He tried again with 4 games, 1 story, which ended up being somewhat helpful in solving FNAF 4. But just imagine for one beautiful, perfect moment if Game Theory went with that second option instead. It would have been just as hype, especially with their superb narration animation and editing, way more narratively satisfying, and most importantly, right. Even if it wasn't 100% on the money, it would have facilitated discourse about the game instead of shutting it down. I mean, they could have still used the exact same format of this video, and just had the one insane, massively overlooked, incredible, unbelievable clue that solves everything be the garbled phone guy audio in the background of FNAF 4, proving that the dreamer is the older brother and the security guard, instead of the stupid alarm clock thing. Dream Theory's impact on FNAF was so huge that it not only dominated fandom discourse for years, but permanently altered the trajectory of the games themselves. The next game afterwards, FNAF World, is full of meta-commentary on how Scott messed up by not making his intentions with FNAF 4 clear enough and failing to end the story how he wanted. I have a whole video about that, you should check it out if you're curious. But the extent of Dream Theory's impact on Scott's creative decisions wouldn't truly be seen until the next mainline game, Sister Location, which is almost a complete 180-degree pivot from FNAF 4. Not only is Sister Location's story much more linear and less open to interpretation, but it's also heavily grounded in reality, by which I obviously don't mean realism, but just the physical plane of existence, with little reference to spirits or dreams or anything like that. Unfortunately, Sister Location may have been too much of an overcorrection, because its connections to FNAF 4 only confuse things further. A lot of fans to this day truly believe that Dream Theory was the intended solution to FNAF 4, and was simply retconned by Sister Location because people didn't like it. Which is unfortunate because it allows people to toss out any amount of evidence from FNAF 4 because, hey, that game was retconned, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It has always mattered, and it was never retconned because Dream Theory was never canon. After Dream Theory, Game Theory had one last chance to redeem themselves. One final FNAF 4 video before the next chapter of the series began. So let's see if they were able to get it right. This video looks very bizarre, and that's because it was premiered live as part of another live talkback segment, and for whatever reason, they must have chroma keyed the whole thing for a green screen effect. I don't know the terminology, I'm not a VFX guy, and that applied to the video segment too, so all of the greens were removed. MatPat starts the video out by reaffirming his commitment to Dream Theory as the definitive answer to the series, but he also outlines the main points of evidence against it, which are: Bite Victim is afraid of the springlock suits, the puppet isn't well explained, Scott said the FNAF 2 video got almost everything right, the minigames don't really make sense, and the multitude of things in the series a child would have no understanding of. Basically, all the points in the vein of the lore being too detailed and too intentional for Dream Theory to work. In a just world, these points alone would be enough to disprove it altogether, but instead, we're getting an alternate explanation to go on the side. At this point, I'll take what I can get. He moves on to the first main point of the video. Fredbear's Family Diner is the sister location of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which is actually another idea they came up with towards the end of the live stream. Like I said earlier, I'm inclined to believe this theory, but the way Matt explains it here is way more confusing than it needs to be. He says that the original Fredbear's Family Diner is the restaurant we see in Save Him, and the murder there causes the original owners to sell out to Fazbear Entertainment, who then open a second Fredbear's Family Diner with a redesigned Fredbear alongside the FNAF 1 location, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. That's all to say that the springlock failure at the sister location mentioned by Phone Guy in FNAF 3 is... Bite Victim getting bit at Fredbear's Family Diner, which causes the two other springlock suits being used at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to be retired. Once again, doubling down on this fundamental misunderstanding of springlock failures. Yeah, it's still annoying, but the gist of this idea of the early timeline structure is fine. If you wanted to make it better, you could just say that the Puppet Kid was killed at the same restaurant. You don't have to invent a weird proto-Fredbears to fit that in. And you could say the springlock failure was something else that we don't see. But that would run the risk of being an unsatisfying answer. Moving on from that, Matt once again goes over the basic details of the MCI, drawing on evidence from the FNAF 3 tapes and the FNAF 1 newspapers. But notably, he names a year this time. 1983. This is actually the best answer for the MCI date at the time, because it makes sense for the FNAF 3 tapes to originate from around the same time that we see these yellow springlock suits being used in the FNAF 4 minigames. It also provides more than enough room in the timeline for the restaurant to slowly decline afterwards, as the newspapers say, before being reopened in 1987. Remember, 1985 was never a date given in the games. We've only had it since the release of Into the Pit in 2019, so in lieu of that, 1983 is perfect. But more importantly than logical sense, it also makes the most narrative sense, and it explains a lot more about FNAF 4 than just the timeline, and that's what MatPat talks about next.
He's always at the pizzerias, especially towards the end of the day, so he'd definitely be in a position to see something like this. It explains his irrational fear of the yellow suits because he saw people get taken to the back and never return. The lines of "remember what you saw" and "you know what will happen if he catches you," if this were indeed true, this line takes on a whole new meaning. What if they were literally his friends? That he knew the kids who went missing and got stuffed, and the plushies being there in the final scene represented not his plushies, but the spirit of his friends, the ones possessing the suits, being there with him as he dies.
Finally, after all of Game Theory's coverage on FNAF 4, MatPat is cooking. And no, not just because I'm partial to MCI 83 and happen to agree with him, but let's be real, this is the only analysis of FNAF 4 at the time that makes any sense of what the is going on in these minigames. I just cannot believe that some version of this is not what Scott had in mind here. Everything just seems way too random otherwise. Matt goes on to further explain what this means for Bite Victim and his role in the story at large.
All of the final lines aren't in the yellow used for psychic friend Fredbear, but rather a mysterious new off-white color. So who's speaking? Well, who else but the one figure we know gives life to children dying in events around the Fazbear Entertainment franchise. It's the puppet. I will put you back together. He's planning on reuniting the spirits of these 5 friends. It's the conclusion to the whole story. And who's the one we see in this minigame putting everyone back together again? The puppet. Just like he promised the boy he would do on his deathbed.
Now, this is also great analysis, and I strongly agree that Happiest Day is clearly meant to be a recreation of this event. It honestly seems like one of the least subtle or open to interpretation things in the whole series. But there are some issues with MatPat's assessment here. First, and he does point this out to be fair, it contradicts the idea that this was the springlock failure from the tapes, because that had to have happened before the MCI, and obviously Bite Victim couldn't have seen the MCI happen if he was dead. Thankfully, this isn't the springlock failure, so that's not a real problem with the theory. It's just unnecessary for Matt to have included. Second, it doesn't really explain the Fredbear plush at all, which is understandable since that's the biggest issue I always run into with this theory too. I'm not really sure if Matt is saying that Bite Victim possesses Golden Freddy and is therefore the 5th missing kid, but if he's not, then Fredbear plush can just be the 5th instead. Of course, I've figured out who the Fredbear plush really is, and if you want to find that out, check out my video on it. Finally, I am still not 100% convinced that the text color change for these final lines was ever intentional. It just seems like too easy of a mistake for Scott to have made and too minute of a detail to have massive game-changing lore implications. However, if you do think that it was intentional, having the puppet be the final speaker does admittedly make a lot of sense. I'm not down with it, but I think it's a fine theory, especially at the time. Anyway, with all of that MCI business out of the way, Matt moves on to go over the rest of the timeline, starting with FNAF 2. As always, the exact timeline of FNAF 2 is tricky and overcomplicated, but Matt puts it together fairly accurately without getting too bogged down with the details. He says the 5 new purple guy murders, the DCI, go on to possess the toy animatronics, which is a fairly popular theory to this day that makes sense on the surface but still leaves a lot of questions. If you want to see a better, more thorough explanation of the DCI, the toys, and the puppet, I have a video on that too. And I promise that's the last of my theories I'm going to shamelessly self-promote in this video. He reiterates the Bite of 87, which is pretty clear-cut at this point and not drastically changed since the last timeline video. He then moves on to FNAF 1 and once again doubles down on 1993.
It doesn't matter if you're working night or day shift, all workers get paid on Fridays, and November 12th, 1993 landed on a Friday. It just fits.
Again, I don't really care about the exact date of FNAF 1 as long as it's clear where it falls in the timeline generally, but saying all workers get paid on Fridays is just dead wrong and easily debunkable with like 2 seconds of research. Whatever.
With the restaurant reopened one final time, we see this scene, where the puppet is waking up the spirits inside the animatronics one final time.
This is definitely an editing error here. This was supposed to be these cutscenes from FNAF 2, which makes way more sense than give gifts, give life. I actually think that's a great explanation for what these cutscenes are. They're meant to show us that the puppet is in the FNAF 1 location. We just don't see it in the game because, Scott hadn't actually come up with it yet. Anyway, MatPat wraps up the rest of the timeline pretty similarly to how the last one went, since there's not much to dispute about these later events at this point. And he ends the timeline off with this.
Was that answer satisfying? You see, that's the beauty of the dream theory and the frustration of anything else. There's so much lore, so many puzzle pieces to fit together that in order to account for everything, the story can't get much simpler than that.
I just don't agree with that assessment at all. Dream theory is only easy to follow because it purposefully brushes aside a lot of the complicated or difficult to understand details in order to make itself work. So yeah, it's easier to follow a version of the story that ignores tons of important stuff, but you're still not getting a satisfying answer. On the other hand, this timeline is not that overcomplicated, especially if you work out a lot of the kinks this video adds to it. If you were to take the Foxy Bros security guard theory from the live stream and combine it with everything you said here about the MCI and Bite Victim, you have an infinitely more satisfying and meaningful story right there. Not only that, but it would actually facilitate further discourse about FNAF 4, since it still leaves a bunch of things unanswered or not fully explained. People could try to work out how those ill-fitting pieces fit into this established story, instead of throwing them all out because, hey, it's all a dream, and it was all retconned, and none of it matters. Just to top it all off, MatPat uses another recent quote from Scott to prove that dream theory is right, I guess?
The truth is that after a while, lore becomes so dense that there isn't room for a story anymore. Sometimes the timeline gets so full that the only way to tell a real story is to have the story set in a different timeline. End quote. So there you have it. Dream theory for your simple answer, and a 20-minute long timeline for those of you who want something a bit more complete.
No, that's completely out of context. He's literally talking about the canonicity of the books. It's insane to take this quote so far out of context, actually. I guess it's somewhat of an appropriate note to end on, though, honestly. So, Matt's overall assessment of dream theory versus the timeline may be dead wrong here, but at the very least, this final timeline is extremely solid. It is much, much better than any of their previous FNAF 4 theories, and it actually gets to the heart of the intended story of the tetralogy, or at the very least, some version of that with lots of room for healthy discussion and refinement. Unfortunately, this final FNAF 4 video has been largely forgotten in the grand scheme of things, forever living in the shadow of dream theory. That, sadly, will always be remembered as Game Theory's contribution to FNAF 4, even though this video is a much better assessment of the game and doesn't just, destroy the entire lore in the process. At least it will always be here for us FNAF historians to revisit and think about what could have been, were Game Theory to have chosen the good ending. With all of that being said, it's hard to say definitively whether MatPat solved or ruined the original FNAF lore. The expectations he and the community set for himself put him in a position of profound influence over our collective understanding of the game's story and the story itself. That came with a lot of baggage, a lot of outcomes that were arguably bad for FNAF. But at the same time, it was probably all still worth it. Love him, hate him, or thoughtfully and critically analyze his impact on the franchise, FNAF wouldn't be what it is today without MatPat or Game Theory. Not even close. He carved out a large, vibrant space on YouTube for lore discussion, and his content introduced countless lifelong fans of the series into the community. Him and the space he helped to create inspired so many of those fans to take the next step and put their own thoughts and ideas into video form, who in turn inspired more and more. And that is what has kept FNAF alive for long past its expiration date. Not just alive, but thriving, honestly, despite what some FNAF doomers may claim. The franchise is arguably more popular now than it ever was, and these classic Game Theory episodes laid the groundwork for that longevity. MatPat is, and forever will be, a legend. Now, as you know, we have merely scratched the surface of Game Theory's FNAF series, but that will have to wait for part 2 of this video. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and you'll be among the first to see it. While you're down there, go ahead and let me know your thoughts about everything we've talked about today. I'm really looking forward to hearing them. That's all for now, guys, and as always, thank you for calling 808 Freddy's.